So I want to talk about the debt schedule. And the debt schedule is one that throws people off often because it's just not so linear. You know, the income statement, you make 2014 and you copy it to the right, or the balance sheet, you balance it, you copy it to the right. It's a little bit haphazard. It's not, there's a lot of different ways to interpret a debt schedule. It has its most significance later on when we do leverage buyouts, because the managing debt portion of a leverage buyout is key to converting a leverage buyout into a positive return, which we'll talk about. But in general, the point of a debt schedule is to maintain their cash and debt balances, and the interest expense on the debt balances, and the interest income on your cash balances. That's the point of the debt schedule. And it's managing it in such a way to determine what are the pay downs, what are the premiums, what are the principals, and most importantly, if you have some sort of revolving line of credit, how do you model out the revolving line of credit such that it would kick in if you have a cash need, or it'll raise debt if you have a cash need, or it'll automatically pay down as you have a cash surplus. And you can set up your debt schedule to pay down not only just the revolving line of credit, but it can pay down other types of debts in tiers. And there's an automatic way to do that. So that's the complexity of the debt schedule. So the first thing, oh, I thought I had the Excel open. The first thing is the general layout, which usually is consistent amongst most debt schedules, is at the top there's a section that explains and describes the cash available. So let's see if that shift over here. Final schedule here. So at the top there's a calculation to help determine the cash available to pay down debt. How much cash do you have that's free to be used to pay down debt at will? That's what this calculation is. And there's usually several lines that go into that. We'll talk about that. Underneath this cash available to pay debt calculation, there are several sections, each that represents the type of debt that you have. So if you look at Walmart's balance sheet, and I would use the balance sheet to determine all the different levels of debts outstanding. Walmart has, let's start with the short-term debt, short-term borrowings. It has a portion of long-term debt due within a year. It has a portion of capital lease obligations due within a year. It has long-term debt, and it has long-term capital lease obligations. So there's 5 pieces of debt in their balance sheet. Now, some people choose to combine the short-term portions with the long-term. If they want to, you can consolidate as you want. I don't think it makes such a big deal. So in other words, the long-term debt due within 1 year, some people like to combine with the actual long-term debt. I don't like doing that. I think if you do it this way, you can be a little bit more accurate with the way the debt's being managed. So I separated the debt schedule out into 5 different pieces as described in the balance sheet. In other words, in the debt schedule, I have a section here for each type of debt that I just identified. The short-term debt borrowings section, long-term debt section due within a year, capital leases, long-term debt, and long-term debt obligations under capital leases. 5 different sections. Each section contains a beginning balance and ending balance, a line for interest expense, interest income, and 2 lines in between that will help us determine raising and paying debt in different situations that we'll talk about. So this section I just copied 5 times. So that's part 2. So in the beginning, it's identifying cash available to pay down debt. Underneath, it's the different debts. And at the bottom, we're totaling items. We're totaling all the issuances and retirements. An issuance is a debt raise, or retirement is a debt pay down. We are totaling all the interest, and then we're calculating the cash at the end of the year, and this cash at the end of the year should match the cash on the balance sheet. That's the core structure. This will give us 2 important pieces for the rest of our model. This will give us interest expense and interest income for our income statement, and all the identified debt raised and paid down go into our financing activities in our cash flow statement, completing the model. Okay, so let's model it out. So that's why it even sounds convoluted, right? So that's why this one takes practice, and this one a lot of people just don't get on the first shot, so don't worry about it. But let's start. The first starting point that I always go to is we want to start by pulling in the ending balances from the balance sheet. We want to pull in the last reported balances. It's those last reported balances we will use to build the future balances. The last reported balances of cash and debts. So I'll start with here. The 2012 short-term borrowings end of year, the last reported balance of short-term debt will come from our balance sheet in 2012. Short-term borrowings. The long-term debt due within 1 year we'll pull in from the balance sheet. Long-term debt due within 1 year, last reported balance. The obligations under capital leases, this is the current portion of capital leases due within 1 year. Balance sheet. Capital lease obligations due within the year. The long-term debt due within a year. Balance sheet. Long-term debt. The capital lease obligations, end of the year. Capital leases. These are all the ending balances. These will be used to model our next year. This just came from the respective balance sheet lines. Questions on that? And then finally, cash at the end of the year. Our starting balance of cash at the end of the year. Sorry, the starting point will be the ending balance of cash from 2012. Each of these ending balances will be used to create next year's starting balance. You guys have that? Starting at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, what I like to do first is I like to build out the debts before doing the cash. So I'm going to build out the debts. And what I'm going to do is, first thing, 2013, they're asking for the short-term borrowings at the beginning of the year. And so what I'm going to assume is the short-term borrowings at the beginning of the year is equal to last year's ending balance. Whatever balance was at December 31st is going to be the same the very next morning of the next year. That's the assumption made. So the ending balance drives next year's starting balance. Just, yeah. Then we have issuances and retirements. And for each debt, as I just mentioned, we have two lines. We have mandatory and non-mandatory issuances and retirements. As discussed, an issuance is raising debt, a retirement is paying down debt. I'm going to assume for now, and the difference between mandatory and non-mandatory is kind of mechanical. It's for our model. So mandatory issuances and retirements are known payments. You raise debt, there's a principal payment maybe. The debt has $1,000 or $1 billion principal payment that you have to pay every year. You know that. You're responsible for paying that. That's mandatory. Non-mandatory is automatic. This is what I kind of mentioned with the revolver. Non-mandatory is if we happen to have a cash surplus and we choose to build our model such that if it happens to have cash, we can pay down as much as we can. That's non-mandatory. That wasn't part of the contract. That wasn't part of the principal balance. That's just us kind of choosing to pay down at will. That's non-mandatory. So kind of the accounting idea, issuing and retiring, raising debt and paying down debt, it's the same thing. But I've just reserved two separate line items because the non-mandatory issuance is going to be an automatic formula calculation that's going to look at the cash and determine and say, do I have cash and do I want to pay down debt? Versus the mandatory, which is going to be planned from the beginning. As soon as you raise the debt, you're going to have to model out that we have to pay down $1 billion in principal each year. And I don't want the mandatory issuance to interfere with the automatic formula, so we separate it out into two line items. Yes, AJ, get a question.
Would that be just pretty much a calculation of what the minimum interest payment would be, or off that?
This is not interest.
Oh,
This is principal.
Okay.
You get like a mortgage principal.
Okay.
Some debts amortize over 20 years, right? And the principal payments. Yeah, interest is separate, but good clarification. Okay, this is where we're at. So for now, let's make them zero. We'll talk about paying it down. For now, we'll make them 0. But the idea is, if we were to raise debt, whether it's mandatory or non-mandatory, we'd have a positive value. A positive value is raising debt. Positive value because it's bringing in cash, it's bringing in debt. So the short-term debt at the end of the year is the sum. It's the sum of the starting point plus any other debts that might be raised. If it was a pay down, it'd be a negative value in there, but you're still summing it, right? Because if there's a pay down, it'd be the beginning of the year less any issuances or retirements. Yes,
For
John.
the non-mandatory, do they state that in 10K, or
No.
is it just kind of something that a scenario?
It's a scenario. Yep, we'll do it. And then we have interest. Right? So how do we calculate interest? So let's get, for Walmart, let's get a little bit more accurate with the interest. And so I'm going to pull up the annual report. And if you pull up the annual report, there it is. There is a table that talks about the interest. Should be coming up. Here are the pay downs. Not quite yet. I'm surprised. Did we pass it? Okay, we passed it. Let me do a search for interest. It was supposed to open right up to it, but it had closed, and then I had to open up the core file again. I'm going to do a search for interest. Sorry for the delay. I think it's right underneath this table, actually. Here it is. Nope, these are pay down obligations we'll talk about in a second. It should be... Here it is. Okay. These are the liabilities and the rates associated with those liabilities. Okay, so short-term borrowings, the 4047. This is the 4047 that we've identified. They say that it has an interest rate of 0.1%. Now, it's not really 0.1% interest, but I guess just given the fact that it's going to pay down soon, that's all the interest that's left. So we want to model it out that way. So the interest rate I'm going to put is 0.1%. And I'm going to calculate the actual interest on that, and the interest on that is 0.1 times the balance. But we take the average balance. We take the average of the beginning of year and end of year balance. And we take the average, in this case it doesn't matter, but we take the average because if there was debt paid down, so let's say we paid it all down. 0. If I didn't take the average, then 0.1 times 0 would be 0 interest. And the question is, maybe it is 0 interest. It depends. Depends on when I paid down the debt. If I paid down the debt January 1st, meaning 364 days, the debt was gone, then maybe it was basically 0 interest. But if I paid down the debt at the end of the year, December 31st, then there's 364 days of interest. Maybe I should be charged with interest. I don't know when I paid down that debt, so I take an average. If you want to get that granular, then you should be building a multi-model. So to simplify, we take an average equals, we always do equals average, beginning of year, end of year debt, times the rate. And we'll copy this whole thing to the right. And we'll talk about pay downs. But this is the process for building out the debts, and we'll do this for each debt. Yes. Yes.
When did you use
I could have. Doesn't matter. I could have. Either represents the beginning of the year, or this represents. You could have done the same. Yep. Okay. Everyone has that? Okay? Now let's look at the long-term debt due within a year. So long-term debt due within a year, kind of the same process in the beginning. Beginning of year equals the end of year from the year before. Let's for now assume 0 mandatory, non-mandatory issuances. Let's do an alt equals to sum everything. And then we want to identify interest. Guys have that? Build that out quickly. And so when we want to figure out the rate on this interest, if we go to this table, you'll notice that we have 1975, they have here 1475 and 500. That's our 1975. 1475 and 500. They separated it out into two pieces. One portion that's fixed, one portion that's variable. So you can separate that if you want. I think it's overkill. We can get a blended rate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1475 times 4.8 plus 500 times the 5.29. Is that 5.29 times 5.2? See what that blended interest was and back into the blended rate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right into the interest expense, and I'm going to do equals 1475 times 4.8% plus 500 times 5.2%. There's a couple ways I could have done this. And I'm going to do each one differently just so you see all the kind of different ways. I'm going to calculate what the blended interest they had paid on it was. 1475 times 4.8 plus 500 times 5.2. Yeah? It's basically 96.8. And I'm going to divide to get the implied rate. So they paid an implied 4.9% interest. Okay? Kind of see what I'm doing there?
What do you do for G24?
The rate divided by the debt. So next year, I'm going to use 4.9. I'll just have it equal to the year before. Or did I hard code it in the book? Nope, I did equal to the year before. And I'll copy the top section to the right, the 1975. And I'm just going to recalculate my interest expense as I did above. I'm going to do the average, beginning of year, end of year, times the rate. It's going to look like 96 for now. But that might change if we happen to do future paydowns. That's one way to do it. Whoops.
That's your root concept of your outfall.
Yeah.
96.8 and the rate should that be on potential with that rate?
Yeah, and it is. And this is blue.
But wait the interval. It's a formula there. So
These are assumption drivers. This is a hard code. This is assumption driver.
which is a hard code.
This is 96.8. A hard code. I consider this a hard code.
Okay.
It's a formula, yeah, but it's a formula of hard codes.
Okay.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I consider that a hard code. I don't want people to get lost and say, oh, this is like a formula, meaning it's dependent on other hard codes. This is the hard codes. Gotcha. You guys got that? Next, same idea. Cap releases beginning of the year equals year before. 0 for mandatory, non-mandatory. Add everything up. I'll copy this to the right. Okay.
We're just taking that build model approach, like, then we're gonna go back to this.
Well, we're not going to tweak the interests. We're doing the interest now.
Yeah.
Mandatory, non-mandatory, we'll talk about those, yeah. Okay, capital lease interest was tricky. They didn't talk about it. So I'm going to do something that I don't recommend to default to, but I found it allowable in this situation for good reason. And I'm going to figure out how much interest was incurred by back calculating into the interest paid divided by the debt balance. Now, the reason why I often don't recommend that is because I've seen analysts take, if they don't know what the rate is, total interest and dividing it by the total debt balance and expecting that that's the interest rate. I do not recommend that. I do not recommend that because there's so many levels of debts, right? You can't just do that all across the board. There's long-term debt, there's short-term debt, there's, subordinate, senior subordinate. But what's unusual and interesting about Walmart is they specifically separated out the interest expense on just the capital leases. So if you arguably had interest expense on current portion of long-term debt, interest expense on long-term debt, interest expense on current portion of capital leases, interest expense on the revolver. If you had interest expense broken out by every single piece of debt, then yeah, maybe you can back into it. But you can't take total interest and divide it by short-term debt and expect that to be an accurate interest rate. But I'm going to do it in this case because they did, for whatever reason, separate out the interest expense on just those capital leases. So I'm going to back into it, and also because I have no data to go by. But just don't confuse and interpret that as saying, well, I could just take interest expense divided by the debt, and that's going to be my interest rate. You can't do that because generally, in a model, interest expense is one line item, and a company has many tiers of debts. In this case, they've separated out the interest expense on just the capital leases. So I will do that with the capital leases. I'm going to take the 288. I'm going to divide it by the average of the capital lease 12 and 11 balance. Yes?
Well, is there, in direction, I can see how you're going the right way, but a challenge with having the short-term capital lease and versus the long-term capital lease? Is there a situation in which those rates would be different?
Yeah, it would. And it is for the long-term debt, only because they give you a haircut because that short-term capital lease is probably going to come due within a specific year. So they haircut it by the number of days of it outstanding. We're not going to get to that granularity. And that's the biggest flaw with doing it this way. So good point. Okay, so I'm going to do it a little bit differently than they have it. I'm going to link it up a little bit differently than in the book just to be more accurate. But so the way we're going to do it is we're going to go to the debt schedule. And so if you look at the balance sheet, well, let me just show you the balance sheet. So the balance sheet, so the first thing we want to identify is we're going to identify the capital leases, the short-term and long-term. So in 2012, they had 326 in short-term, and they had, where's the long-term? 3009 in long-term. And then 2011, they had 336 in short-term and 3150 in long-term. So I'm literally going to take the interest expense in 2012 divided by the average of 3150 plus 336 and 326 plus 3009. So I hard-coded this in the book. I'm going to link it in the model just so you see exactly where it comes from. I probably should have in the book had it linked. But so I'm going to do equals. I'm going to back calculate into the actual interest expense by taking equals the income statement 2012 interest expense on capital leases, okay, divided by the average, open parentheses, so make sure you got this. So it's the interest expense on capital leases divided by the average of, guys got that so far? Balance sheet, 2012 and 2011 short-term and long-term. So I'm going to do capital leases due within 1 year plus long-term capital leases, comma, same thing in the year before. Short-term plus long-term, comma, short-term plus long-term 2011. Capital leases due within 1 year, short-term, plus capital leases. Enter, 8.4%. Some people look lost. I took equals income statement F28. 2012 interest on capital leases only, divided by the average balances. Average, open parentheses, the short-term and long-term portion of capital leases in 2012, comma, short-term and long-term portion of capital leases in 2011. That gave me 8.4%. That makes kind of sense. Too aggressively high but it's a capital lease.
Now, do we copy and paste that to the right or hard code the interest rate?
You can, I just copied the whole thing to the right. I mean, I wouldn't hard code it.
Okay.
You know, you said, yeah, no, I wouldn't hard code it. That's what I did. Yeah, I copied to the right. Okay, and then we can now use the typical formula to calculate interest expense, which is the average of this year, end of year, beginning of year, times the rate, and then we can copy the whole thing to the right. Well, okay, so we need to anchor these references before we do that. Or I'll just have H31 equal to the year before. So in the book I copied it to the right because this is all hard-coded. It's fun. You guys have that? Any questions on that? Okay. Now we do long-term debt. Long-term debt equals the year before, zero out mandatory, non-mandatory issuances, add up everything, copy to the right. And now we have to look at interest expense. Now we have another problem that you might often find. And that problem is, here's their long-term debt, 44092 plus 1770. That's their long-term debt, is not 44070. It doesn't match. No idea why. Struggle with that. I don't know if it was a mistake. I tried looking at it different ways. I tried subtracting it from the current portion. It just doesn't add up. I don't know why. So what do you recommend I do? What do you think?
kind of similar to the long-term under capital leases.
Why? How?
Well, I mean, if that's not adding up either, then I guess that.
But I have the rates here.
Oh, yeah,
Capital leases, I
oh,
didn't
you-
have the rates.
Oh, you have the rates, oh, okay. Could just think of the average.
Yeah, you can take a weighted average of the rates. And that's what I did. I took a weighted average of 4.6 and 2.0, and then applied that weighted average towards the balance that we have in long-term debt. But you see the problem, I just couldn't take, these numbers don't match, so I couldn't take it, I gotta take a weighted average. So what I did was, I had equal to, in parentheses, and I just hard-coded it in. I had the 44092 times 4.6 plus 1770 times 2.0. So I did 44092 times 4.6 plus 4770 times 2.0%. Did I do that right? 44092 times 4.6% plus 1770 times 2.0%. Okay? 44092 times 4.6% plus 1770 times 2.0% divided by that overall balance, 44092 plus 1770. Divided by, in parentheses, 44092 plus 1770. That'll give me the weighted average. 44092 times 4.6% plus 1770 times 2% divided by 44092 plus 1770. And that gives us 4.5%. The very next kind of okay, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to take the average of this year, last year, times the rate, copy everything to the right. Got it? Okay, then we got to do capital leases. Capital leases, beginning of the year equals end of the year from the year before. Zero everything out, add everything up. What do we use for the rate? We actually calculated that in the capital leases above. We did a blended of the long term and the short term. So I'm going to pull in that 8.4 from above, and I'm going to use the average formula again. This year, end of year, beginning of year, times the rate. I'm going to copy everything to the right. That came from above. Got it? Now we have some things to total. We have the total, the issuances to total. We will add them all up. There's 10 of them, 2 for each. There's mandatory, non-mandatory for the short-term debt. Add them up. Plus, mandatory, non-mandatory for a current portion of long-term debt. Plus, mandatory and non-mandatory from current portion of capital leases. Plus, mandatory, non-mandatory long-term debt. And mandatory, non-mandatory of the long-term capital leases. It's 0 for now, but it will have significant value as we work with those mandatory issuances and retirements. We also want to add up all the interest, which is the short term plus the long term due within a year. There should be 5 of them, plus current portion long term, obligations plus long term, plus the long term of the obligations. 23365. Note that that kind of falls in line with what we have historically, so looks pretty good. It was 18, 2000, 21, 6, now 23. It's pretty steady. You want to always check for that. If you see a significant drop in interest or a significant jump in interest, you've done something wrong, unless you're aggressively paying down the debt. Okay. Now we have cash at the end of the year. Before we have cash at the end of the year, we have to do cash at the beginning of the year. Cash at the beginning of the year, whoops, just like our debt balances, is equal to the prior cash at the end of the year all the way down at the bottom of 2012. Got it? We then have this line item that's called cash flow before debt paydown. This actually comes from the cash flow statement. If you notice at the bottom of the cash flow statement, we have this line called cash flow before debt paydown. We have to calculate this. This is a measure of all our cash flows, excluding the cash flows that come from our debt issuances and debt retirements. What are our cash flows from our debt issuances and debt retirements? These 3 line items: short-term debt, long-term debt, and capital leases. We want a measure of cash that excludes that. Why do we want a measure of cash that excludes that? Because the point of the debt schedule is to determine how much cash we can use to pay that debt down. So we don't want to include and double count. So we want to calculate cash in such a way that excludes these 3 line items. Although it doesn't make sense, although it's a little bit, right now those line items aren't filled out, but once they are filled out, it will matter. So we want to sum up, we want to record a measure of cash that completely excludes those line items, which is the sum of cash from operating plus cash from investing plus all the financing line items that do not include the line items related to debts, which means plus the dividends is okay, plus the treasury stock, which is okay, plus other, plus the effective exchange rate, what is that, in cash.
What about non-controlling interest, Paul?
And plus non-controlling interest, thank you. I missed it.
What about debt issuances?
That's what you want to exclude. The debts, everything from debts, before debt paydown, before debt issuances and debt paydowns. Are you saying specifically debt issuances?
Yeah.
Before debt issuances or paydowns, absolutely. Because it's the debt schedule, we will determine our issuances and paydowns. It should be cash flow before debt issuances, paydowns. Yep, good point. So we want to copy this to the right. It looks the same, it will change. And do not, some people think, oh, I could just take the total cash and subtract these line items. Do not do that. You will create a circular reference. You'll create a redundancy. You want to add up every line item, leaving those line items out as if those line items did not exist, because this is the cash that we're going to use to determine how much cash we can use to pay down debt. So this number we will link in to our debt schedule. Cash flow before debt paydown. We will link in from the cash flow that we've just calculated, cash flow before debt paydown. Okay? And then we have minimum cash cushion. Now, minimum cash cushion is tough to identify. It basically is representative of the cash that you don't want to touch. Because the point of calculating this is to say, how much cash can we spend to pay down debts? We could spend all of it. But the minimum cash cushion says, yeah, let's spend all of it. Make sure we have a certain amount on our balance sheet all the time. It could be zero. In leveraged buyouts, it's basically, well, it's a very small number because you want to pay down as much cash as you have. A company like Walmart, they might want to leave a lot of cash on the table for emergencies, or, you know, a lot of times lenders require you to have a certain amount of cash in your balance sheet for emergencies. You want to save that, maybe sometimes a percentage of working capital. They don't really explain how they calculate their minimum cash cushion. They really explain what their minimum cash cushion is. You can search for it, but they usually don't find that out. Now, in the book, I assumed $1 billion, just arbitrary. I probably should have rethought that. What I would actually do to figure out what the minimum cash cushion is literally look, and I'd go back 10 years to see what's the lowest number of cash balance that they've had. If you go back with Walmart over 10 years, they never really dipped under $5 billion. Probably a good reason for that. I probably should have used $5 billion for minimum cash cushion. I used $1 billion. But either way, they're never going to get there. So it's usually insignificant. It has more significance in your LBOs when you're really streamlined, when you're literally, you want to operate the business with as little cash as possible. If you have any cash, you want to use it to pay down debt as quickly as possible, and your minimum cash cushion is like zero. In a company as big as this, you'll never hit your minimum, but it's important to know techniques. People always ask me, how do you project minimum cash cushion? I go back 10 years and look at what their minimum balance has been. And you can kind of identify that. With Walmart, is around $5 billion.
Isn't it that you then take a certain percentage of the minimum of the last 10 years? But just take the minimum 10 years.
Why would you take a percentage of that? You mean haircut it?
Yeah.
No. Why would you cut it? I wouldn't cut it.
Because as you said, it's likely that the company will never hit its minimum cash cushion.
So you're saying to have a larger number?
Lower.
A lower. I would do lower than what their cash cushion was. I hope I understand your question. My point is, they'll never hit it anyway. They won't hit $5 billion. They won't hit $1 billion, even if we pay down all their debt. Well, no, if we pay down all their debt, yes, but they're not going. That's not going to happen, and we'll explain why. We're running out of time, but Jenny, let's think about, maybe ask me again tomorrow morning once we have it in there. I hope I understood your question properly. But so basically, I'm going to put in negative 1,000. And so the total cash that we have available to pay down the debt is the sum of everything. It's the cash that we started with, the 6,550, plus all the cash generated this year, excluding debt paydowns, less the cash we don't want to touch. And we'll start tomorrow by reiterating this. So let's just copy that to the right, stop here, and tomorrow we will complete this. We'll talk about how do you step back and look at the model, how do you think about it, what are things to look for from an associate perspective, and then we'll get into valuation.